So my name is Ken Seasholes. I'm the manager of resource planning and analysis here at Central Arizona Project. And I was the lead staff person at CAP on the pieces that came together for the system use agreement. I've continued to work on those projects since.
I'm Leslie Meyers, and today I'm the Associate General Manager for Water Resources for the Salt River Project. I've been there about 7 months. Prior to that, I spent 34 years with the Bureau of Reclamation, the last 8 or 9 as the area manager for the Phoenix area office. So I spent most of my career working with these gentlemen and Central Arizona Project. My role actually, I think probably maybe prior to becoming the area manager, I worked really closely with Jim Beadnell, who was a contract specialist in our office, and with CAP and Ken and Suzanne Tickner, and we hammered our way through the details of the system use agreement.
I'm Patrick Dent. I'm the Assistant General Manager over Water Policy at Central Arizona Project. But for most of the work on the system use agreement, I worked in our operations group and did, I'll call more technical work on the water quantity and water quality side of the elements of the agreement, and kind of looked at how functionally we would move water through the system. So I've had a number of different jobs at CAP over the years, and it seems like every one of them at least had some assignment in the development of the system use agreement.
So the system use agreement is an agreement between CAWCD, the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, our formal name, CAP, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And it addresses 3 main areas: wheeling, exchanges, and firming, and kind of brings those together in a way that it also addresses how we use our system to deliver our base Central Arizona Project water.
So you use 3 words here, which I think we'll probably use frequently. So let's go ahead and give some simple definitions. So wheeling, firming, exchanges.
Right.
Define.
So wheeling is taking a supply other than our base Colorado River supply and moving it through the Central Arizona Project, delivering it. That could be a groundwater supply. It could be Colorado River supply that's not our base supply. So so-called non-project water. Firming is the use of one supply to make another supply more reliable. Typically, we think of that in terms of recovered water that's been stored in our aquifers, but it could be other supplies. And then exchanges is when 2 parties have the legal right to a supply, but physically they let each other use those supplies for more efficient use of the supplies. So.
Good. We all good with the definitions?
Yeah, Ken did a great job.
So let's set the stage, and we're going to circle back probably frequently and certainly at the end. But why is the system use agreement so important especially when we consider Arizona's water future and future CAP operations? And we'll start with Ken, but then I'd love to hear from all of you.
So the one commonality between those 3 things is really flexibility, the use of our system in a way that's not just the standard diverting water off the Colorado River, delivering it to a customer at a turnout. And flexibility is a key component of how we need to manage the supplies we have. But probably the part that most of the attention has been focused on is wheeling, because that's bringing new supplies into the CAP service area. And as we face reduced availability of our Colorado River supply, those kinds of supplies are going to be ever more important, both to be able to fill in for supplies that are reduced, so firming, but for new uses as well. And so there's lots of interest and potential to do that. We have a system capable of delivering additional supplies and a lot of interest in doing this.
I think there may be 2 other things that it's helpful to have, and that is, Ken mentioned some of the kind of legal frameworks that the system use agreement and the purpose of those. Those knowing the types of things we might do help with long-term planning. So if we're looking out a decade or decades, the idea that we would be able to use the infrastructure in these kinds of ways and the tools that would be in place, even if we don't have the specific thing or the agreements identified that we would use, it serves a very helpful long-term planning function to know, hey, we can use the CAP, we can use this tool, and it'll require these kinds of activities to make that happen. It also created some certainty for existing users, in the sense that they would know if other people wanted to bring water into the aqueduct, how would that might affect my contract, and what would happen to my existing services, whether there be cost impacts to me, whether there be operational impacts to me. And so we work through, we'll probably talk about that, how to address some of those. The other thing I think it was helpful with is there is an infrastructure component to it, and we will talk probably a little bit more about capacity here in a moment, but it did give us a framework to think about how the infrastructure might change through time, and that also aided in a planning sort of benefit. And so when we think about how we're going to operate and maintain the existing system, things we might do in the future can be considered in the context of, well, it won't always just be Colorado River water that we see entering the CAP system.
Right. And that's really, in a sense, the crux. I mean, somebody might think, well, you've got a canal, just put water in it. It doesn't really matter what water. I mean, it's been Colorado River, but it's so much more complicated than that.
So one of the things I would like to add is, especially because we're talking about history, is that this concept of wheeling, or using this beautiful piece of infrastructure to move more than just CAP water, was envisioned from the beginning of the project. The project was designed with, I would say, extra capacity so that we could meet peak demands in the summertime, because primarily in the beginning, especially, water went primarily to agriculture. And so when the Bureau of Reclamation and Central Arizona Water Conservation District, CAP, first developed their very first agreements, they envisioned there's contract provisions stating that we knew that there would be wheeling, and we would work on those details later. We just didn't know it was going to take us 20 years
30.
to do it. Right. But some of that was really out of just the time and space that we were, and what we were using the canal for, and where we were in time, even when we signed the system use agreement. And I would just say that we knew that this was coming, that things were changing, but I couldn't have even envisioned then that we would be where we are today.
Yeah, for sure.
But I do think that the agreement that we developed set us up very well for where we are today.
Agreed. And I just to amplify a point about history, Leslie mentions our contract. So there's lots of legal provisions that we've had to work through, but the 1988 master repayment contract explicitly contemplated wheeling, and there were multiple attempts through time. In fact, our first request for wheeling occurred before our first delivery of CAP water, before the project was even capable of delivering water in 1982. And there were points along the time where we tried to address that particular provision. And so in some ways, everything that happened afterwards built on that, but bringing it together with these other provisions actually made it stronger. So if we'd managed to get that one piece back 20 years ago, we still would have had all these other issues. So took a long time and was painful at times, but because it brought together multiple pieces, kind of resolved more than one, both legal and physical issue.
Yes.
So on that point, with these words, wheeling, firming, exchanging, my understanding, Leslie, and with the Bureau, is that there was a concept, we'll address all of these separately, but you advocated to bring them all together. Can you expand on that a bit?
I did, and maybe some of that was because of my newness to the process. I know Ken had been working with folks from Reclamation prior to that, and at the time we had a lot of discussion about firming and recovery and how we were going to move water around during shortages. The federal government has obligations to do that. The Water Bank and CAP have obligations to do that. And I think in my mind, it just made a lot of sense for us to pull everything into one place and do what Patrick said, which was be very transparent to all of the water users about what folks that wanted to wheel needed to do and what their expectations should be, and then what existing users' expectations should be. And I actually, when I was thinking about this, one of my very explicit memories is sitting in the Verdi conference room at the Bureau of Reclamation, drawing on the whiteboard the list of priorities and what would eventually become Article 11, I think, in the agreement. It took us a while, but I feel like we came out with a very straightforward approach, and that there was a lot of support for the agreement because we came about it that way.
So this question just came to me as you were talking. Is that why the term system use agreement? It's an agreement on the various ways you could use the system?
It is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so
That was new too. We came up
so
with that during the process.
just to add a little more texture on that, we had been working separately on these issues, each of which had lots of contention, lots of complications, and lots of institutional kinds of things. So we'd worked on something called qualifying activities for firming,
Yes.
and City of Tucson, actually going back decades as well, in the Tucson region had thought about inter-AMA firming, but that got contentious. And we had tried literally for decades to work on a standard form of wheeling agreement. We had these concepts together, and Leslie gets all the credit in this case of being the one to say we need to bring them together, and that the key aspect of doing that was the scheduling priorities. And that's where I think also internal to CAP, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how the system impacts would be both with new supplies, but using existing supplies more flexibly. So at the time, it felt like the three boulders we were trying to push up got heavier than one big one, but ultimately it was a better solution.
Great. That I think that helps the understanding a lot. Was there anything that you had wanted to add?
No, I wasn't there to draw on the whiteboard.
But, so you guys were all kind of coming up with the various uses for the system. Meanwhile, you're dealing with the infrastructure and the engineering of the system itself. So when it was first considered, like you said, you were in a different role, you were managing water operations. So from an operational perspective, while they're drawing on their whiteboard, what are you thinking about?
There were a few different things that we considered through time. The scheduling provisions that Ken just mentioned were a key component because we had informally, I'll say, developed an annual plan every year. We didn't call it that prior to developing the system use agreement. But that's when with our existing users, that's when a lot of their contracts rights were expressed, and when they made their water orders, and we essentially made a commitment to develop or to deliver water at a specific time and a specific volume. And so that seemed to be like a good time to interface with other water users. And so that was a concept that was incorporated in these scheduling priorities. Is we would develop an annual operating plan, we would develop water delivery schedules for water users, and then we defined how those water delivery schedules for folks who wanted to do firming exchanges or wheeling would interplay with those existing water delivery schedules. And so in that specific role, I don't know if I'm circling back to your question, but that specific role had a lot of engagement in trying to think through that and how that would actually work. I'll mention capacity again. I always knew that capacity constraints would change through time. At the time when we were doing a lot of this work conceptually, we still had high levels of ag deliveries in the CEP system. Certainly in more recent years, we've seen shortages. Deliveries will change again in the future. And so some of the constraints that we thought about in the development, I knew would be important or not be important under a different set of circumstances. And so one of the challenges was trying to be thoughtful about something that would have to work in a number of different scenarios, and even don't get too spun up about, well, this year that's a terrible idea for one reason or another, because it was meant to be a long-term effect, and you just had to try and create a set of guideposts that would help you be able to build up and develop an operating plan so that you could actually execute it.
Yeah. So at the time, shortage was kind of this thing, like someday we might be in shortage, and here we sit and we're in shortage. So it's amazing to me to learn that early thoughts were even increasing the capacity of the canal. Is that right?
So even before we worked on the system use agreement, we did have those provisions in the master repayment contract, which I think I want to qualify. Was only a sentence, 2?
Yeah.
Maybe.
It's a short.
A very short paragraph.
But,
yes.
but to Ken's point, the concepts of wheeling had been around for a long time, and maybe even in some folks' minds, there would be times of surplus on the Colorado River, and we'd have a very abundant, full aqueduct. Don't know if that's going to happen in the balance of my career, but and then there might be other water supplies that people would want to move through the system that they had access to that would always be there. So the thought was we may reach capacity limits, whether they be temporary in time in the year in our plan, or maybe more wholly across the entire aqueduct itself. And so from kind of an infrastructure planning perspective, Larry Dozier at the time, and this is going back 20 years ago, said, well, we don't know exactly in the future what those capacity needs might be, but let's at least acknowledge that they will exist. And if we're going to do something in an O&M capacity, might we do something to the aqueduct in our capital program that would at least put us on the right path for future capacity expansion. So he tasked me with, he called it the holes study. We're not going to make tunnels bigger or siphons bigger or things like that, but if we looked at the aqueduct, what kinds of improvements might we make through time, kind of with the existing infrastructure that would allow more water to make it through? And a simple example was, even at that time, and this would have been the late 90s, early 2000s, we had replaced some impellers at the Mark Wilmer pumping plant. And the new ones they put in took advantage of some available horsepower capacity in the existing motor, and they increased the flow of the entire plant. We analyzed the tunnel to see if it could handle the additional flows, and it could. And so are there things like that could be accomplished? And so we did a study in the 2004-2005 timeframe to just identify where our limitations are and what are kind of the boundaries of the existing system. And even in some, I can think of one specific project, we'd had a section of the canal that had subsided a little bit through central Phoenix, and we were going to raise the lining to restore the capacity that had been lost due to this kind of localized subsidence. But we said, well, we're doing a project, we're going to have a contractor, let's design that for something more than the subsidence did. So at least one time we were thoughtful about, hey, we're going to spend some money to do something, we should be focused on renovating our aqueduct. Use that word, O&Ming our aqueduct in a way that makes sense in the future.
So we contemplated potential engineering changes, even thinking about increasing the capacity. But now where we stand here in 2023, and we'll get to this, but we still actually haven't used the system use agreement yet. But are there still engineering changes that would need to be made before water's wheeled, exchanged?
No, actually. I think that access to the aqueduct is in that list of, was it Article 11 that you said? There's a framework in the existing agreement for us to move water through the CEP system. And there's frankly two, and Ken will do a better job talking about this, but there's two sorts of provisions for both the district to enter into wheeling agreements and for Reclamation to enter into wheeling agreements. Reclamation and frankly Leslie have been open in the near term of using the existing capacity under their existing authorities. So right now we have a clear path, and I think there's even one maybe in 2023 that will, the Queen Creek agreement, who is transferring a Colorado River entitlement, will be delivered this year under the system use agreement with a wheeling contract through the Bureau of Reclamation. So.
Awesome. So we will definitely talk about that. Did you want to add anything?
Well, we'll get to it, but there's a tight connection between really the seminal work that Patrick did, evaluating the ways that you could modify the infrastructure, and the solution that we came up with to get past a legal impasse about interpretation of our authorities. And that kind of reconceptualized capacity and how it related. But that there were a couple of places where the intersection of these relatively arcane kind of legal contractual articles and how they're interpreted, that on the ground infrastructure and how you actually operate the system came together. And that was where those pieces, where the idea of capacity and using the system more flexibly came together.
So before we move on, one kind of thing I want to touch on is we've talked about water for ag. Of course, we know that we supply water for cities and industries, private water companies and all that, but also tribes. And so Leslie, with the Bureau, the Bureau has trust responsibilities for the tribes. So could you talk a little bit about the unique issues and perspectives that brings into the system use agreement?
Absolutely. And it did bring in some kind of unique perspectives and issues. But the United States, so originally 9 tribes got CAP allocations, and those contracts are directly with the Secretary of Interior. So they're secretarial contracts and between the Bureau of Reclamation on behalf of the Secretary and the individual tribes. After that, the state of Arizona in earnest worked on negotiating Indian water rights settlements, which was a way to settle claims on behalf of the tribes for water to live and prosper on their reservations. And so CAP offered a very unique opportunity to the United States and the other parties in the state to settle those claims because we had a water supply. And after 2004 and the Arizona Water Settlement Act, we actually had a bigger water supply to be able to do that. So what happened was many of the tribes ended up with not just their original CAP contract, which was high priority Indian priority water, but additional CAP water that was a lower priority. And in the Arizona Water Settlement Act, then, because some of that water was a lower priority, the United States and the state of Arizona were tasked with firming, which is what Ken talked about earlier, and that meant providing firming that lower priority water to a higher priority in times of shortage. So it generally means that if the tribe's lower priority water is shorted, the state and the United States are responsible for delivering water in lieu of that. Not all of the water, but some of the water. So again, another very complicated concept because we in Arizona like to complicate water.
We do. We do.
So, and we've very intricately woven every aspect of it, which makes it hard to do almost anything. Or anything new, let's say that. But the United States was very interested in the firming aspect and how we would be able to move water and firm water with the system use agreement. We also wanted to make sure that it was clear to the tribes. We consulted with all the CAP tribes throughout the development of the system use agreement on what we were doing and why, and what it meant to them and what it meant to their water priorities, which again was why we went back to the scheduling priorities, because it made that clear. And then when we talk about these 2 different ways to wheel water, the master repayment contract said, we recognize that there's going to be existing space, and that's part of the existing federal system. And so the United States can wheel water, and we lovingly called that 817. And then there was a second provision.
Why 817?
Because that's the provision in the master repayment contract.
Article number, yeah.
Article 817, and then Article 818 talks about the CWCD's authority. I'm paraphrasing that, but again, it's just a couple sentences to wheel. So it was just really important to talk about what the United States would use its space for, how we would enter into agreements for it, how it would be prioritized, and even within that space, how it might be prioritized first to tribes and federal purposes, and then to others. So some of these other projects that we're talking about now, Queen Creek would move through that federal space because there's a lot of empty space right now, right? And because there haven't been 818 projects yet. So what we did was, it all comes back to that terminology of flexibility, reliability, what we could best do with the system and use it to its fullest. But I think that the United States came out in a very good place with the tribes in the end, and they were very happy with the outcome as far as being able to see how their water would be prioritized, how their water would be firmed, and potentially how they could move forward with wheeling non-project water in the future, and how their contracts would be implemented.
Yeah, so just one other great points, and the connection with the federal responsibilities. These two articles in our Mastery of Payment Contract that have been kind of the root of the dispute, and maybe that's even too strong in a way, but just difference of opinion, of an interpretation. Really, the practical impact was the 817 rights of the United States meant that our ability to wheel reliably under the 818, predictably to meet the state's assured water supply rules or build a treatment plant where you're building a community off it, there was potential certainly that there could be a displacement. And so the connection, and certainly there was a concern, and I would say still probably is, that if the US authorities were used for communities, that down the road, maybe even decades down the road, that the tribes might be disadvantaged, and that it would be practically that capacity would have been taken. So the connection again back to improving the system and making accommodation for these new supplies came together by saying, well, we can at least point to ways that the project can accommodate all of the new supplies without infringing on the existing rights of the system. And that was where some of the federal issues, and particularly with the trust responsibilities, came in.
Yes, some of the concerns of the tribes, yes.
Great, so there's, like you said, a lot of complexity. I know you're an engineer, you're by trade.
Geographer. Political scientist.
But I'm assuming there were a lot of lawyers involved with all of this as well. Can you kind of, because we're going to start moving into, system use agreement being signed, what are some of the impediments, why it hasn't been used yet, and then, how will we use it? But anything else to take us up to the agreement actually being signed, more stakeholder engagement, anything like that we should consider in terms of what it really took to get the thing signed?
I would say it is important to recognize how many processes there were up until that point. On the wheeling side, I would point to a couple instances. There had been an effort actually originating with a non-project supply from Scottsdale back in the mid-1990s, and that ultimately didn't pan out in terms of wheeling. There was a workaround. But there was a formal, what was referred to as Project Wheel, which was, I think, actually an acronym, to try to talk about how to essentially divvy up the capacity, the excess capacity of the CAP. And that's the way that the issue had been framed for a long period of time. That led to a little bit of an increment of understanding among folks, but didn't get all the way done. There was another lengthy, very heavy stakeholder process called AdWater, which goes back to this era really where we were anticipating the possibility of very large new supplies along with potentially full canal, and how to work those things through. Ultimately, that conflicted with some of the Secretary's authorities, and there were other issues with that. But coming out of that, we had a wheeling public process with our stakeholders that started to really get more honed in on some of these particular processes. Like, what are the constraints? Capacity isn't just a static number, it's got all of these other complexities. And that got to an idea that we would not just be divvying up the capacity, but we could incrementally contract for it.
Yes.
That was a key component that was moving forward along with these other processes. So there was a lot of hard work from many people, definitely lots of lawyers. So it is important to understand that the pieces that ultimately came together in the system use agreement were ones that had been cobbled together from previous efforts.
So when would you say, like, if you had to put a pin in it in terms of when this started, like what year would you say?
1982.
Okay, like you said, even before the first water deliveries were made, because the first water deliveries were 1985. So 1982, now we've gone through all this, are we ready to sign?
Ken could put 2010 or 2011 though. When did we start in earnest after AdWater was done, thinking about the framework of where we're actually at?
Yeah, so that is much later. I'd have to think about the.
We had the stakeholder meeting. Sorry to interrupt you, Ken, but we had that stakeholder meeting where we started talking about capacity and scheduling and costs in 2014.
Yeah, the 2014 process, relative to the wheeling in particular, that's really where you start to see the elements that ultimately became embedded in the system.
Yeah.
Things about water quality.
1982 started to even become obvious in people's minds that, okay, we may need to be thinking about some other things if we're going to use this in a more flexible way. Ultimately, that's where the concepts started.
Right. Our board took a position at that point about saying that wheeling would be a great idea, but maybe premature. And so yes, the things that were much more, that you can see a direct path to where we ended up. I would say the 2014 process was a big jump forward in terms of the wheeling piece. And
what do you think jumped it forward? Was there an event? Was there something that kind of kick-started the whole thing again?
I do actually think that the kind of the aftermath of the process from AdWater, which was, I would say, probably universally viewed as not successful, but folks wanted to at least rescue the standard form of wheeling contract. Mm-hmm. That was a specific task that was worked on. And Reclamation and CAP worked independently and then coordinated on some concepts. That public process sort of reframed how you could move water through the system. It wasn't an allocation process. It wasn't a CAP allocation process. It was going to be something that had to be more tightly coordinated with the Bureau of Reclamation.
I think too that there was some more specific discussion about bigger exchange concepts, the Phoenix Tucson thing, that just some really big issues that came up that we could resolve with the system use agreement, which was nice. The United States was in the process at the time because there was still excess water and they were storing a lot of excess water and working on firming plans, as was the Arizona Water Bank, and we were looking a lot at recovery and how we would do that. There was a lot of questions. I think there was a lot of really great ideas and concepts about flexibility and what we could do, but we really didn't have that functional, foundational agreement in place that we knew would allow that to happen. So I felt like there was a lot of questions and things. We weren't quite at the brink of where we are today, of really knowing that we were going to firm in the very near future or that we were going to wheel in the very near future. But there was just all these things in the queue that Reclamation and CAP were talking about. And I remember at the time thinking, we can wrap all of this, we're back to that, we can answer all of these things with the system use agreement. And it really was the 2014 timeframe. And I will say, in the whole scheme of things, because I think we signed February of 2017.
2017, okay.
That was kind of light light year speed, right? I mean, in 2 years, we really wrapped up the whole thing. And CEP really led a huge public process on that. And Reclamation did a lot of work in consultation with the tribes. And so it was a pretty intense effort. And it turned out well.
Yep.
So February of 2017, it's finally signed. Was it a ceremonial thing?
Maybe it should have been.
At our board, it was ceremonial.
Yes, it was.
So was it a CAP? It was. Well, it didn't look like this then, or did it?
It did. It was right here.
It was right here. Lisa
so
signed it.
Yeah, there was a little bit of ceremony around that.
Yeah, I was here.
The reclamation signing was a little less full.
Yes. Up until that date, there was a lot. There was, like everything else, there were a lot of other things going on for CEP and reclamation and water in central Arizona. And I felt like the stars aligned and we grabbed I think probably CEP said, today's the day we're going to sign. And so we signed it, and I believe I took it and went and met our regional director, Terry Fulp, who happened to be in town, and CEP, I don't think, was aware of that. Well, I'm sure after. He was at the Phoenix Open. And so he and his wife came out and met me, and they signed it on the back of their convertible Mustang rental car in the parking lot. And somewhere there's a picture of it. And I brought it back, and it was done. I felt a great deal of relief when I handed it back over to somebody in the front office that day. It might have been Ted.
So that date is also significant because the commissioner there was a change in administration as well.
Yes.
And so there was to give due credit, our general manager, at the time, Ted Cook, had understood the importance of it and had a role in it. There were very high-level discussions about pushing it forward and getting to a point of signature. We'd worked out, the lawyers had cleared the language and all of that, but Esteban Lopez was departing.
He was on his way out.
And we still there was a direct push about the opportunity to sign before new administration. Not necessarily that the new administration would oppose it, but just you have a change in personnel, and
And it was, I think Esteban's last day was probably January 20th, and we signed early February. But sometimes it does just take that political push.
Yep.
As at our level, at the staff level, we were very anxious to get it signed. All of us, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's finally signed. You're at the time still working in operations, but starting to move into the policy realm. So as we now kind of get into where we are today, tell me from a policy perspective why this was so important and what it meant or will mean to CAP's future.
Oh, there's just so many reasons. Maybe the paramount. I'll take the context from right now. So here we are in 2023. We're looking at potentially significant reductions of an available CAP supply on the Colorado River. Lots of conversations going on about how to implement those, and how we might use other water supplies to ensure that there's water available for people in central Arizona in the midst of a historic drought on the Colorado River. So item number one is, thank goodness that this is done. If we were doing this, right now on top of all of the other things that we are trying to do, it would be very difficult, and certainly we couldn't have time to do the level of stakeholder engagement that we did in this process. And frankly, the level of detail and debate and good work that came out of it into a thoughtful product, because we would be in more of a reactionary mode. So from a policy perspective, the one thing I'm just grateful for is that it's the work's done. It's a tool that we have available to us right now to use going forward. I would have thought maybe in 2014 or 15 that wheeling was the most paramount component of moving other additional supplies to water users, and AdWater had been focused on that, and I'll say, at least in my mind, that would have been maybe the first and largest priority of completing the agreement. But the reality may look something different, where we will need to do firming, and I'm sure many folks, maybe even some of us, will come up with new and exotic types of exchanges that will need to occur to address the drought on the Colorado River. So from a policy perspective, it's great that it's been completed, that it's in place, and it provides a framework for us to develop solutions that we need to have right now.
It's a great perspective. It's interesting sitting here in 2023, right, to think of that. One thing I want to just quickly, because I know that this is complicated, but again, back to simple definitions, because we've mentioned AdWater a couple times, we've mentioned excess water a couple times. Can you give us just simple definitions of what those are?
Sure. So excess water, which is a slightly unfortunate term, is the Colorado River water that was available to CAP above and beyond what's needed to satisfy the long-term contract. So Leslie mentioned the federal contracts for the tribes and the subcontracts with cities and industry and others. So when the supply is large, there's actually more water available because we have a contract that allows us to take all the water that's available. And so for many, many years, we had a very large amount of that supply. We've used it to do underground storage for water banking and things like that. It's no longer the case, but that's what that term is. AdWater was also an acronym for the process, but it was that CAP would be the acquirer, developer, and deliverer of new supplies for the Central Arizona Service Territory, the 3 counties territory. And it was predicated on this idea that there would be a kind of a wholesale role for CAP to move these new supplies to meet at the new demands, or potentially for other kinds of demands. So it had a lot of this kind of concept in its mind about that we were going to be having supplies in the CAP aqueduct other than the supply that's available under our current contract.
Great. So it's 2023. System use agreement was signed in 2017. Hasn't been used yet. But there have been some implementation issues, particularly the establishment of water quality standards. So can you tell us why water quality? What's that all about?
So water quality is sort of maybe self-evidently important, but there is a provision actually in our article under Article 818 in the Master Maintenance Contract about water quality. And so we recognized all along, and certainly going back to those earlier processes, that we would need to establish guidelines, rules about the kinds of water that would be introduced into the CAP. So again,
because you're not just moving Colorado River water, you would potentially have other types of water,
right? So
commingling in the canal.
Exactly, and so there's groundwater basins that can be pumped and delivered pursuant to state statute. There's water that's been stored underground that would become potentially directly introduced into the CAP. The quality of the Colorado River water is, to many people, surprisingly high. It easily meets, in most cases, the drinking water standards established at a federal level. Obviously, there's treatment for the deliveries at the treatment plants, and so there's a lot of concern about, or just emphasis on, establishing standards. The system use agreement, in one sentence, says that CAP and Reclamation would jointly develop uniform water quality standards. We had touched on some of those issues in the earlier processes, but we knew this was an implementation step. Complicated, lots of strong opinions about water quality.
From our customers.
From our customers, from the public. Certainly there's visibility issues. There are federal oversight at some level, potential, what we might consider threats that way. The two main kind of perspectives that we spent a good couple of years working through was, should you establish these standards at the quality of the water that you're introducing, or should it be at what's ultimately delivered? And so it comes down to sort of how you think about the blending of the new supplies and the others. Even if it's a high quality supply, it's going to be different. It's going to have different chemical, physical characteristics in our supply. Where we landed on this process, jointly working on it, but again, lots of stakeholder input,
Yes.
lots of strongly held views on both sides, was that the emphasis is on the introduction, that the quality of the water going in has to be very high quality, essentially meeting drinking water standards, even though it's an open aqueduct, before it's introduced, to be protective of ultimately the quality that's delivered to the end users, whether they're agricultural, tribal, municipal, or otherwise. And so water quality is a complicated area, lots of strong opinions. We have worked through what we're referring to as a guidance document. It has been approved on CAP side. It's still pending on Reclamation side, but it is a very detailed sort of set of processes to determine and to have enforcement essentially about the quality of water to make sure it stays acceptable.
Right, and it's really about consistency. And I think Ken said this, but CEP, Colorado River water quality, to date has been pretty consistent. And so water users are used to getting water of a certain quality. For their treatment plants have been designed for that. The ag users are used to specific water quality, and it's good water quality. So the biggest thing I think that the equalizer for the water quality was that we understand that there's going to be times of shortage like we are today, and that water is important, and sometimes maybe having water is more important than what the water quality is because water is life. But on a general day-to-day basis, we needed to look for consistency. So there is a provision in the proposed guidance that says we can re-look at it when we get to what I would say are these more emergency situations and rethink about that. And I think we may, before we ever even implement it, we may be looking at those provisions.
Well, and so one of the ongoing points of maybe disagreement or perspective is about what happens with the blending. The way we landed is that the quality can change, even without making modifications on the standards, and that what we've committed to is we'll model what the impacts of these new supplies are on the blend of the water quality, but actually at a set volume, no more or less than 1 million acre feet. That recognizes that when we're in situations where we may have even less than that of our base Colorado River supply, that we would see a larger change as these supplies are blended. But at that point, an acre foot of water has much higher value, and you can treat to modify the water quality.
So much complexity that would not consider. So that guidance document has been approved by our board, the CAWCD board. It's waiting on the approval of the federal government. That's where we're at? Are there any other roadblocks, impediments, anything else that would need to happen to, we're going to talk about Queen Creek in a second because we've mentioned that a few times, but anything else that needs to happen to allow us to use this agreement finally?
So there is another piece of work that's on our end to work forward, and that is related to this idea that we can add capability, you can say capacity, but it's a more subtle concept to the system. In order to use our CAP's authorities under Article 818, we have to have a project identified and approved, not constructed, but approved before we can issue those contracts. Patrick has mentioned that in the interim, we've agreed that we can essentially borrow the authorities of the U.S. under that. So that's still work to be worked through. That's a relatively near-term thing. It's not an immediate impediment to moving the supplies. We will, in addition to like a Colorado River transfer, the Queen Creek one that's been mentioned, because it's Colorado River water, it doesn't have the water quality aspects to it, so it could move without final approval on those. We will see the exchanges, I think, in 2024. Leslie mentioned it in passing, but there was an agreement between the City of Phoenix and the City of Tucson, very innovative and one that we've supported, but was contentious at the time to figure out how it gets implemented, which allows some of the capabilities for pumping in Tucson to benefit the Phoenix area. So I expect to see some of those happen actually for 2024 as well. So there are definitely some additional work. The water quality, we need to get past a hurdle on that and have that actually implementable for some of these say groundwater supplies. But we have a clear path at this point for wheeling and at least of the Colorado River supplies, and for exchanges and firming for that matter.
So it's February 14th, 2023. We've mentioned a few different things, but what if you had sitting here today, what would you say the system use agreement is going to be used for the first time for this? What do you think that will be?
I think it's going to be used in the first time in the near term to help essentially augment the supply that we have. Patrick has mentioned we're facing the prospect of very deep reductions to the Colorado River supply, our base supply. There's whole sets of processes to try to work through that, but there are supplies that will need to be made available, and I think maybe in particular, some of the exchange opportunities are where we'll see some of the near-term action, just because it's there's some uses that are more immediately impacted by shortage. Treatment plant, direct delivery treatment plants are the most heavily immediately impacted. There may be users willing to do some exchanges to have some supply go forward. And an acknowledgement of Leslie's current role at Salt River Project, we have existing exchanges with CAP, and we have the ability to currently deliver into the SRP system. Being able to do that physically from the SRP system to the CAP system is another piece that we're working on, a piece of
Yes.
design for infrastructure, but the system use will help facilitate that. So
Yes.
there will be activity that may be not as obviously connected to the system use agreement, but as Patrick points out, having that framework in place, we don't have to fight over how it gets implemented is crucial.
Yeah.
Sure. What if you had to quantify? Like maybe we do this interview again in 10 years. What?
We won't remember again.
So to remind ourselves of what do you think? Looking back, once this is used for the first time and sounds like maybe used. What do you think looking back? You would say. About the system use agreement and its importance.
I'll let others amplify this, but I just maybe pivot on the point that Patrick said. Having it in place, it doesn't have an expiration date. We can have the ability to modify if we need, but establishing the rules of the road. And my expectation, particularly on exchanges, but all these other provisions, is they're going to be used in ways we haven't thought about yet.
Yes.
But that's what we want. We want to see creativity, but have that creativity. Everybody's playing by the same rules. They know what their impacts are. We can have the system. So 10 years from now, certainly 20 years from now, we will be using the system in a way that we don't currently think about, I think is.
I agree. I think this is very foundational. And I feel like we spent a lot of time when we were working on it trying to think of things we hadn't thought of and how to address that. And I think it would be a huge win if 10 years from now we found that this actually provided an opportunity to do even more than we ever envisioned. I think, and you mentioned that we're both engineers, and I've said this before, and it always makes people laugh, but we have this beautiful piece of infrastructure, and we have more beautiful infrastructure at Salt River Project, and all we know is that there's a lot of risk and uncertainty to our water supplies, and what we need is flexibility and reliability, and we need to be able to interconnect those systems. There was a time in the early 2000s, because we had the CAP SRP interconnect, that CAP could support SRP when they were in short years, and now it's time to reverse that and to protect Central Arizona. And the beauty of this is it allows for those things. It absolutely allows for those things, and it's ready to go. And I think we should all be very proud of that.
So 10 years from now, I would say I probably think this today. The system use agreement, Leslie used the word foundational. It's on the list with the 68 Act that authorized the construction of the Central Arizona project, the master repayment contract that kind of set our contractual framework for delivering Colorado River water, and our agreements with Reclamation about how the project would be turned over. The system use agreement is another kind of culminating piece of legal and policy work that allows us to function and do our job, and becomes one of the framework pieces of work that we will use like forever. Like it'll just be something that endures to help us accomplish our mission at the Central Arizona project.
One last thing that I'll add, and Ken has said this, at the time, it seemed like there was a lot of hurdles to get over to make it work. But when I look back on it, it just seems like it just acknowledges and respects both entities, and it does what we needed it to do. So it's almost hard to remember where we started and where we finished, but I think we came out with a really great product.
Sometimes those memories come back.
That's great. Is there anything, in the name of an oral history that you think didn't come out, didn't get discussed, or you were hoping to get in there? A little story, a little fact, a little anything?
Well, I will say one thing, and partly because we don't have the lawyers here.
Is that intentional?
I concur. I'm proud of it. I think it's going to serve us well, and it came about in many instances. We talked about a couple of them because of failure of other things, or things that reached a dead end. I have some vivid memories of a meeting at Paradise Bakery with the solicitor's office representative and our lawyers and sponsors, in which we were talking in that case about firming, how to use a supply for that. And the United States took a very hard position, saying, well, just because you've invested hundreds of millions of dollars and stored all this water underground doesn't mean you can use the system to move that supply. And those are hard points. We had some late hard points related to provisions of the 1968 Basin Project Act and capacity that we had to overcome. It's a cliche at this point, but like failure was not an option. We have made these investments. I think of all of the ways that we have to be able to use the system more flexibly. And I think the relationship between CAP and Reclamation, the personal and the professional relationships, and actually putting some of the history behind us was crucial, because we had significant friction over lots of issues in the past, including over some of these provisions, and saying, you know what, we can't let that be the thing that impedes a good outcome.
I may have one thing. I'm not sure if Ken wants me to share this, but but I'm going to put it in context first. So we did, myself included, but a little bit more with Leslie and Ken and Suzanne, who's not here with us today, and I think Greg or Rhett Rhett did a lot of work on this, and Lisa Lance at the solicitor's office kept doing the work. Like this is work because there wasn't necessarily an immediate need, could have been deferred.
Yeah.
And I'll go back to the point that I made earlier, which was I'm so glad that it wasn't. And sometimes these things are easier, sometimes harder to negotiate in the abstract when there maybe isn't apparent need, but you also have the ability to take time to be thoughtful. So the point I wanted to maybe make more directly about Ken, and Leslie may feel about this of members of her staff, and she can chime in. Ken was a continual pusher and moved this work forward, continue to have those hard conversations so that we got it across the goal line. And I remember I got an invitation. We had a dinner. Suzanne very generously, after the signing, maybe not too long after, it was nice outside. We a few of the folks who had been working on it, myself and Ken and Rhett Billingsley, who was the attorney that had worked on it, had joined us. Ted and Suzanne and our spouses actually met for dinner. And Suzanne took some nice moments to recognize at that dinner everyone's individual effort in completing that, which was both indicative of her character, and she was just kind that way. Mm-hmm. But I remember I don't remember anything she said about me, but I do remember one of the things that she said about Ken, and she extended the SUA of the system use agreement to the Seasholes ultimate achievement. And
I'm so glad.
Ken's humbly not gonna acknowledge that, but I don't mind saying it. Yeah. He here at CAP really did have a lot of enduring stamina, and even now when we need to get something moved forward with our board, or there's other staff where people are working on these other pieces, whether it be the water quality or the operational capability, we continue to rely on Ken to help us with both the background of what happened and then some inspiration about why this is important and why we should think about it the way we thought about it to have it completed. So going clear back to the point I made at the beginning, a lot of the value of this is it sets a framework about how we're going to do things in the future. It absolutely provides clarity, which I think is one of the reasons you had suggested that we take a comprehensive view about our needs.
Right.
And I do believe it achieved that, but it achieved that because people took time to not look at the right now and to be thoughtful about where our future needed to go. And then we're disciplined to get that across the goal line so that we have that available to us right now.
And I just want to take a minute to recognize Ken was fantastic. I mentioned Jim Beadnell before, and Lisa Lance. And when we talk about some of the places where we weren't necessarily in agreement, a lot of that wasn't because local reclamation didn't agree with local CAP, because I think we were all aligned in what we needed to do. It was because reclamation is national, and there's other places in the United States that things are precedent setting, and reclamation law. And so I will say that everyone was very creative. I feel like always, it didn't always work initially, but everybody was constantly coming back with a different way to approach things. How about if we try this? And how about if we try that? And it was a very iterative process. And it was definitely stamina is a good word,